The International Strategy Center is a nonprofit organization rooted in Korea's social movements, building solidarity with struggles, campaigns, movements, and experiments abroad. Last month, we interviewed Nick Cernick on his book Platform Capitalism. Today, we continue our deep dive into better understanding the digital economy and what role social movements may play in determining where it is headed. Today's guest is the author of the book Platform Socialism: How to Reclaim Our Digital Future from Big Tech, James Muldoon.
James, so can you give us a brief background about yourself, as well as telling us about what writing this book was like and what inspired and informed it?
Thank you so much for this invitation. It's a great honor to speak here, and I'm very happy to be able to share some of my work with you today. So a bit about myself. I'm a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Exeter. I'm also a research associate at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm head of digital research at the Autonomy think tank. My background is in law and philosophy. I worked as a human rights lawyer for 3 years before I was an academic, and I did my PhD in philosophy, and now I work in a political science department. The book, Platform Socialism, is about how we can create fairer alternatives to today's digital platforms. So it answers questions like, what would a more social just media system look like? Or what would a fairer internet search engine look like? And how would we organize these? One of the reasons I decided to write the book was I wanted to give the perspective of someone outside the tech industry that was looking in. So someone who started from the political questions rather than the technical ones. And I think that kind of critical perspective was lacking at the time. I think the real contribution of my book was to try to turn questions away from a focus on privacy and surveillance and turn to questions of power, ownership, and control. What I wanted to do was to show that we shouldn't just try to fix and repair Facebook, but we should actually be seeking for wholesale alternatives and develop ideas about how they could be built. So in a nutshell, platform socialism is about exploring alternative models of ownership and searching for new participatory forms of governance of these digital platforms.
Many of us have had the opportunity to read your book, but there may be some listening who have not had that chance. And could you briefly explain to them this idea and this concept of platform socialism?
Platform socialism is about reinventing the internet and reimagining how digital platforms could operate. More specifically, it's about focusing on what we could call social ownership, ways in which platforms could be owned and governed by the communities that use them. The idea of social ownership is a little bit broader than two common ideas. We have state-owned nationalization on the one hand, and worker-controlled services on the other. Rather than the state or a small collection of workers having exclusive rights over the platform, platform socialism allows us to consider how broader communities of users might play a small role in the governance of these platforms. What was also really important for me about platform socialism was that it offered an exciting vision of an alternative to the current big tech platforms, and it gave us a new social imagination for conceptualizing and working out what these alternatives might look like. I wrote the book at a time of great cynicism towards digital platforms and tech companies, but I don't think we should let this cynicism become a wholesale rejection of technology and the positive role it could play in our lives. At the time the book was written, the two most transformative visions for 2030 were Web3 and the metaverse. Both have since collapsed and were deeply flawed from the beginning, but I wanted to offer an alternative that gave a more positive vision for what digital platforms could look like.
Thank you. So in your book, you mentioned that platform socialism is a Kantian regulative idea. So in other words, the star in the horizon that we look towards to guide the projects that we build and to shape the reforms that we're fighting for. And obviously academia seems very well placed to develop such Kantian ideas that can really inspire change and solutions to some of our most pressing problems. And not many books have a title as bold as yours. How do you see your work relating to, other work and projects within the rest of academia?
I think academia is a place in which certain radical ideas can flourish. It certainly has the institutional conditions to guarantee people a limited degree of freedom to explore what they want. But at the same time, there are also structural constraints which incentivize people to produce certain kinds of work that will guarantee them promotion and acceptance in mainstream tech circles. At the time of writing the book, the two main criticisms of tech were something that I would call a tech humanist critique, and secondly, a antitrust critique. And I can speak of each in turn. So the first was what I call a tech humanist critique, embodied by writers like Shoshana Zuboff, the Harvard Business School author of Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Let me repeat that sentence just for clarity. The first critique that is prominent in academia at the moment is I would call it a tech humanist critique. It's a criticism of technology and the tech industry from a humanist understanding. And it's embodied by Shoshana Zuboff, who is the author of the book Age of Surveillance Capitalism. What the tech humanist like Zuboff would tell us is that technology and platforms undermine our autonomy. They circumvent our rational decision-making process to turn us into automatons or rats in a cage. One issue with this perspective is that it focuses too much on the individual and it doesn't understand the political nature of the problem or the underlying structural issues with the political economy of the digital economy. CEOs are not able to act more ethically, and consumers are often not able to leave these platforms because of the structural incentives that exist in markets that require people to remain competitive against their peers. The second prominent criticism within academia at the time, even today, is that of the antitrust or anti-monopoly agenda, particularly in the US. The antitrust critic would like us to promote small and medium-sized enterprises within the tech sector and enhance competition in order to deliver greater benefits for the consumer. This criticism, embodied by slogans such as "break up big tech," captures a more accurate picture of the tech sector, which is that indeed many tech companies are too big and too powerful and require greater regulation and control. However, I disagree with the ultimate solution of further entrenching the marketization of online spaces, because I think we should be looking towards non-market-based solutions to these, where digital tools are envisaged as public goods and part of a digital commons that is there for everyone to benefit from. So while these two perspectives were dominant in academia, other more radical criticisms were also present. Authors such as Gavin Mueller and Jathan Sadowski, and indeed Nick Cernacek, who you read last week or last session. And in many ways, it makes sense to read my book after Nick Cernacek's, because I was inspired by Cernacek's book and I wrote it as a kind of successor book to that. So I'm glad that they're being read together as I had, hopefully intended. And I'm very honored actually that they are.
Earlier, you were talking a little bit about how within academia, there are some radical ideas, but that's not really incentivized because of the structures that exist. But do you see any shifts or movements within academia towards, these kinds of more radical imagined futures?
So 2 quick points on this. One is that academia is a contradictory space in which different types of people flourish. On the one hand, there has been more people talking about questions of ownership and control, particularly younger scholars. On the other hand, academia is also constantly in search of the new hype. And at the moment, that's AI. And so a lot of interest has moved from platforms to forms of artificial intelligence. So some of the debates have moved on a little bit, and academics aren't as interested in talking about questions of data dividends and ownership of platforms and ownership of data, because it's less trendy to do so in 2023. At the same time, I don't really think academia is the most important place we should be looking for alternatives. It's much better to look to social movements and activists who are actually developing the alternatives that could be used.
It's interesting talking about social movements. In your monetizing community chapter, you talk about the fact that neoliberalism has really destroyed community in many ways, and that then Facebook inserts itself in addressing this need while also being kind of a part of the problem, and inserting itself in order to extract value from Facebook users. So kind of a two-part question here. We're curious for you to kind of expand a little bit on how neoliberalism has contributed to this destruction of communities. And then what is, Facebook and these other big social media platforms' impact on community and our sense and idea of community?
To begin with your first question, the most important changes that neoliberal has brought about in relation to community has been the erosion of what could be called intermediary organizations and associations in society. Institutions such as trade unions, political parties, in many ways, religious organizations that were a great source of political solidarity for many people. These organizations were gradually eroded through the 70s and 80s on account of some of the economic restructuring that was happening. In addition to the erosion of these organizations, a neoliberal ideology also pits individuals in a stiffer competition against one another and encourages them to see themselves as micro-capitalists that all have a small resource they can develop and build upon in competition with their peers. Third and finally, at the same time, the globalization of capital and the development of new communications technology allowed businesses to outsource processes throughout the globe, which further divided the sense of solidarity that workers could have with each other, because suddenly every component of the process of the production of a good or service can be done at 5 or 6 different locations across the globe. So how does Facebook see itself as helping in this loss of community? From about 2015 or 2016 onwards, many tech companies began to tell a story of themselves as global community builders, as ideally placed to solve some of the problems that they themselves had partly brought about. The traditional critique of these tech companies was that people would spend more time using tech products, more time alone, and more time isolated from others. But the narrative that Facebook and others wanted to sell was of them as pivotal connectors that brought people together and facilitated a new form of community, an online community. In the book, I call this strategy community washing, drawing on more well-known ideas of greenwashing or pinkwashing. This is a marketing strategy of framing an extractive business model through the language of community empowerment and the company fulfilling a social mission. What I argue in the book is that there is very little substance to their claims of promoting community, and that it is a public relations campaign that is rather cynical. if you look at the development of the companies, this so-called mission is only developed a long time after the company has already matured and can be seen as an effort to respond to criticisms of the company and its activities. The reality of the tech company's relationship to community is that it is largely exploitative of the very communities they claim to serve. Facebook pays no money to its users and makes billions of profits off them. And Airbnb can be seen to lead to gentrification and the raising of house prices in the communities, which often push out local residents in favor of huge amounts of short-term rental properties.
You know, for all the complaints, and I think all of the concerns about the power that these platforms have, you know, most of us are still using Google to search, and most of us, or many people, are obviously billions of people or millions of people are using Facebook all the time to connect with others. You know, here in South Korea, we're using Kakao Talk, which is, you know, South Korea's answer to WeChat, to get us to our destination, to order a taxi, to rent a bike, pay for parking, send money, connect with people and businesses. So I'm curious, just from your sort of vantage, what contradictions or even fissures or cracks exist within Google or Facebook or Kakao Talk that have the potential to really start to dismantle that private ownership and move towards their democratization for workers, for the users, and for society.
I'll give you one example of Google because the contradiction is so stark there. Google is, at least Google search, if we focus on this search function and exclude the other elements of their business, it has two essential components to it: a socially useful tool that archives and searches the internet, and an advertising platform. The first socially useful part of the platform was invented first, and people didn't know how it would make any money or be profitable. It was only an afterthought after the dot-com crash that Google discovered how it would become profitable through adding an advertising component to it. Talented young people who want to work there are sold on the idea that they will be solving the world's toughest problems and helping humanity. But many of them end up simply developing advertising products and more complex ways to target certain demographics. And the contradiction is that this socially useful component of Google could potentially be separated from its advertising arm. And I think here we can see the example of a platform like Wikipedia as one possible living example of a socially useful online service that does not thrive or survive on a for-profit advertising model. While this contradiction is easy to see in theory, the political strategy of, you know, what to do about it is obviously much more complicated.
I'm curious then, just, you know, obviously you've had the opportunity to do a lot of research. Again, you have this vantage point from where your work puts you. What chain of events do you think needs to happen, or do you envision kind of happening to see this kind of democratic insurrection, you know, within these platforms and among their users and among society?
I think it's difficult to say. Hannah Arendt, which is the name of a German Jewish philosopher, kind of famously says that revolutions always arrive, they're never made. And it's often the professional revolutionaries who are most surprised when the event occurs. So I find the question quite speculative and difficult for me to answer because it's not really my specialism to prophesize on what would trigger a moment, because that's often very unforeseeable by all parties concerned. However, from past events, we do know for certain the types of things that will not trigger a democratic insurrection. So this includes large data breaches of people's personal data, consumer and advertising boycotts, widely reported terrible labor conditions at platforms, and even Elon Musk buying Twitter was not enough to shift a critical mass to Mastodon. So we know that very little will probably trigger such an event. As a result, despite writing a very optimistic book and having a very optimistic personality, I'm not very optimistic about the possibilities of platform socialism happening in the next years.
You know, we're seeing a lot of polarization online, a lot of polarized debates that happen, and that may be just a reflection of a increasingly polarized society. They're also fueled by these social media algorithms, right? We get these echo chambers and platforms popping up like Parler or Truth Social. I'm curious about your thoughts about how the democratization of social media, for example, or the realization of platform socialism could potentially address these kinds of problems.
The most important change it would make is that the organizations who run social media platforms would not be structurally incentivized to promote the most outrageous and controversial of content in order to generate profit. Content moderation could be conducted according to similar principles that govern other public broadcasters in terms of transparency and fairness. However, we also have to acknowledge the limits of proposals for democratic ownership, and that they are not a solution to all political problems that exist. Conflict would still exist, people with extreme opinions would still exist, and there is a limit to what democratic control could do about these problems.
Your whole book was great, but I really particularly enjoyed the postscript, this kind of imagined future. You don't often see something like that in books, written from kind of an academic perspective. And in that world that you described as a very kind of online, digitally connected world, right now we live in a very kind of hybrid online and offline world that is mediated in a lot of ways through platforms. And so I have a few questions about that. Why do you think platform socialism would create better platforms than what we're currently kind of forced to use?
Firstly, workers who work on labor platforms, if they own their company and gain the fruits of their labor, they could create dignified jobs and decent working conditions for themselves, and they wouldn't be exploited by a company that essentially just wants to make money for shareholders. That would be my first point. Secondly, cultural platforms that produce various audio and visual content could reward artists for their work and redesign the algorithm to encourage a broader range of voices to be heard on these cultural platforms like YouTube, Spotify, etc. Thirdly, we could have a broader range of people from more diverse backgrounds engaged in the design and development of digital tools, so that we didn't all use a bunch of products designed by a tiny portion of largely white American men. Fourth, and finally, just for today, all of the value that is created in the digital economy could be more broadly distributed so that it was shared more equally amongst people who use and consume these products.
In your book, you talk about the fact that moving towards sort of a platform socialism can't happen in a vacuum. It needs to happen in collaboration and cooperation with other social movements. So I'm curious for you to talk a little bit about how you see it intersecting with other issues, around climate change, around inequality, whether that's racial inequality or gender inequality, and how you see that struggle kind of connecting.
I'll briefly mention two on the environment and racism. The huge environmental costs of AI are increasingly becoming apparent. People are learning, even for a single search, the electricity and water usage that is needed to fulfill that search, not only in terms of the current moment in which a person searches, but also in terms of all of the training on the data sets that a computer has to do. Generates an enormous amount of electricity and is incredibly environmentally destructive in the process. Additionally, all of the tech products that we use to access platforms and AI require a series of rare earth minerals, such as lithium and copper, and a whole new frontier of struggle is opening up over the green transition towards not only electrification, but also these new metals that are going to be needed for this new digital economy. And we have already seen some really great scholarship by scholars of color who have pointed out the biased and discriminatory outcomes of AI products in relation to job applications, criminal justice, and even Google Internet search. So as a result, I think struggles for democratic ownership intersect very meaningfully with anti-racist struggles, with anti-colonial struggles, with struggles against patriarchy, and for a more inclusive and equal world.
Yeah, you're coming at this all from, as you said at the beginning of our conversation, from a political perspective and from a political kind of entry point, rather than from that tech insider point. And I'm curious if you've given any thought or have ideas around the kinds of policies that people on the left or even political parties on the left could or should be pushing for to start to democratize these platforms, and beyond that, what kind of coalitions we could start to build to do that as well.
Yes, so let's start with very widely shared and easy first steps that we could take. Things like enforcing large tech companies paying their fair share of taxes and closing tax loopholes that allow them to have their headquarters in places like Ireland, where they can avoid paying too much tax. A second easy step is unwinding certain mergers between large tech companies that perhaps should have never gone through in the first place, and regulating tech companies so that they have certain market caps in terms of their size or share of users. Third, I'll also briefly mention creating a universal workers' rights for workers, regardless of the jurisdiction that they are in or the type of contract that the tech company presumes they have with them. All workers deserve social protections, minimum wage, rights of holiday and sick pay. But more specifically on the development of alternatives, the most important thing would be a public investment of funding into worker-owned, cooperative, and open source businesses. One of the largest hurdles for alternative platforms is user experience. They do not have the money or the resources to make products as friendly as some of the large corporate platforms. Public money could be used to fund such alternatives and also to take advantage of the digital commons that exist and the open source community that could help develop these products. There are obvious drawbacks and limitations with this approach. I'd just like to thank the event organizers and the translator for all of their excellent work and for the opportunity to speak with you today. I believe there will be a Korean translation of the book if it doesn't already exist, but I think that's coming out. There was a deal was signed with my publisher, so hopefully that will only increase discussions like this in South Korea.
Thank you, James. You're very kind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.